evening. I'm Susan Birkinshaw. On behalf of my team, Community Partners for Public Safety, I'm happy to welcome you to our third forum on school resource officers in Montgomery County Public Schools. Welcome to tonight's forum, What is the appropriate role of police in Montgomery County Public Schools? We are coming to you live tonight from Montgomery Community Media Studios. We want to thank them for their production and streaming services this evening. As I've done at our previous forums, I'm going to take a few minutes to share some historical perspective on SROs in Montgomery County Public Schools. CPPS is a nonpartisan public safety advocacy group that has been advocating for SROs in Montgomery County since 2009. We continue to advocate for and share information on best practice school resource officer programs. Historically, here in Montgomery County, we had a best practice school resource officer program before the issue was politicized, and our nationally recognized SRO program was eliminated based on a national narrative and not on local data. We want you to hear the real stories about the program from the people who have experienced the benefits firsthand, and to balance the political narrative with facts and information from right here in Montgomery County that you may not have heard about from either our elected officials or the mainstream media that has been perpetuating the misinformation campaign initiated by some elected officials. You may have even noticed some politicians flip their positions, but CPPS has always stood behind our school resource officer program. We are thankful to be working with Montgomery Community Media tonight to debunk some of those myths. The SRO program was established in Montgomery County in 2002 as the Educational Facilities Officer Program under County Executive Doug Duncan, following the 1999 Columbine High School shooting in Littleton, Colorado. A federal grant funded the first officers, and the program grew to 6 sergeants and 27 officers covering all 25 Montgomery County high schools and 6 of the middle schools. In 2009, the budget was slashed and the program reduced to 9 officers covering all high schools and middle schools countywide. Then in 2010, the program was cut again to just 6 officers to cover all high schools, but thankfully it was not eliminated at that time. In 2010, the Montgomery County Council of PTAs drafted a resolution that was almost unanimously approved to equitably support expansion of the school resource officer program to all MCPS high schools. Also, since the EFO program was not a nationally recognized program, and why shouldn't Montgomery County have only the best, CPPS also advocated to rebrand the program as a school resource officer model. By the 2011-12 school year, there were 13 SROs, including 6 Montgomery County SROs, 1 Rockville City SRO, and 1 City of Gaithersburg SRO, and 5 county patrol officers. It wasn't until after the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in 2012, the program was again ramped up in 2013, and an SRO was assigned to every high school, also supported by our county sheriff's department. In 2018, following the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, the Maryland Safe to Learn Act enhanced the presence of school resource officers in or near public schools with specialized training required across the state. MCPS schools were closed to in-person learning due to COVID in March of 2020, and then in May of 2020, George Floyd was killed in police custody, and the national narrative to defund police began. MCPS reopened for in-person instruction in the spring of 2021, but not before Council members Jawando and Reamer proposed a bill at the end of 2020 to prohibit SROs in Montgomery County Public Schools. Council members Rice and Katz came up with alternative legislation in January of 2021 that would have continued to allow SROs, and Councilmember Navarro came up with another compromise option. But then in March of 2021, Montgomery County's SRO program was suddenly eliminated single-handedly by County Executive Mark Elrich. Although Elrich promised additional mental health resources in our county schools, he later blamed MCPS for not hiring those additional mental health supports. According to the county's own 2016 Office of Legislative Oversight report on the school-to-prison pipeline in Montgomery County, from page 96, I quote, OLO finds that the school-to-prison pipeline within the county mirrors national trends in disproportionality by race, ethnicity, gender, and special education status, but is relatively small and shrinking. Less than 2% of children in the county are suspended annually, and the juvenile arrest rate has fallen by approximately 60% since FY11. End quote. This is the same report with the same findings that were repeatedly cited by numerous students, leaders, and politicians in 2021, allegedly to support their advocacy for elimination of the SRO program. The OLO report has been repeatedly and erroneously summarized and mislabeled. It makes me wonder if any of those citing this report against Montgomery County's SRO program even read the entire 110-page report. We acknowledge that there is always room for improvement over time for any program, but our well-regarded SRO program, a recognized model for the state of Maryland, was removed without due consideration. Montgomery County SROs have never been and are not now involved in school discipline, as the county executive and some county council members would have you believe. The SRO program was removed last year, also in response to testimony from students, many who hailed from schools with 0 arrests, and some who had not even experienced a high school in-person setting due to virtual learning for over a year because of the COVID quarantine, and despite unanimous support from all 25 MCPS high school principals. Since SROs were removed from schools in Montgomery County, we have experienced a violent crime wave here that has not been seen for decades, including the unthinkable school shooting at Magruder High School. Thankfully, that student was not killed, and although his life has been changed forever, so too have the lives of everyone in that school community who experienced the trauma of being in lockdown that day. You will hear many of us continue to refer to the program and officers as SROs instead of CEOs. The new Community Engagement Officer, or CEO 2.0 program, is a made-up, unproven program that is reactive and does not facilitate the relationship building that is the foundation of the Prevention and Intervention SRO program. The irony of the name is that it does not at all promote community engagement. It stretches the capacity of the officers assigned to all 209 Montgomery County public schools, including 25 high school clusters and all their feeder schools, instead of a single school resource officer to each of the 25 individual high schools who support the cluster schools. It is also worth noting that there are many kids who are scared to go to school without SROs, but their voices have not been acknowledged. Children should not have to worry about whether school is a safe place. We must be vigilant and continue to keep our kids safe in schools. We know that children cannot learn in an unsafe environment, and public safety is the #1 job of governments. Following the recent school shooting in Texas, a news report referred to elementary schools as soft targets. With the number of ghost guns and weapons in our community, mental health supports alone cannot protect these soft targets, but trained law enforcement officers can. Seconds count and response times matter. Currently, response times in MCPS without SROs assigned to high schools are averaging 15 minutes. We should be doing everything we can to protect our kids in schools. Regardless of your political party, this includes sensible gun control laws, mental health resources, and law enforcement in the absence of a better plan. As a parent, I am so thankful that my own adult children who matriculated through MCPS enjoyed these amazing officers in both their middle and high schools before the program was reduced and eliminated. I'm terribly disappointed that our current elected officials have not taken the time to walk the halls with an SRO to witness their positive interactions with students before they scrapped the program. Of course, now the new CEO 2.0 officers will have limited time to walk the halls and establish those precious relationships with the students who need them most in our high schools. As a taxpayer, I appreciate that a best practice SRO program is also a best practice in community policing, while both anecdotally and statistically contributing to a safer school environment. Plus, it improves both cost and labor efficiencies in the police department, stretching our county tax dollars, not our police officers. This is a public safety issue. It should not be a political issue with our children as pawns. Eliminating Montgomery County's best practice nationally recognized model school resource officer program by our county executive was arguably irresponsible. Adding mental health resources should not be an either-or choice, but a both-and decision. We should always be looking to improve programs, and Montgomery County residents deserve no less than the other jurisdictions around the Beltway that continue to maintain their SRO programs. And that brings us to why we are here tonight, to continue to share information on these specially trained, award-winning officers who put our kids first, not target them for arrests. I'm happy to introduce Mike Durso, retired MCPS principal and former Montgomery County Board of Education member, who will be moderating our panel discussion this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Susan. I had the good fortune of serving as a high school principal in Washington, D.C., Arlington, Virginia, and here in Montgomery County. And that experience allowed me to have connections and relationships with the SRO program in all three communities, in addition to my service as the Board of Education. We've talked about the title of this evening's forum, what is the appropriate role of police and MCPS? And for starters, we want to show you a quick video from one of our high schools, Seneca Valley High School, that deals with this issue.
Safer schools.
Safer schools.
Safer schools. I decided to start this because of all the incidents that's been happening at Seneca, all the shelter-in-places, the lockdowns, the unexpected bomb threats that we've been having. And it's not just that, we've been having so many fights at school. All this violence has been happening ever since we got back from in-person learning, and it's totally unacceptable. We need change because you should be able to feel safe at school.
I'm supporting my sister, Sophia, and her friends. It's just been crazy what's been going on at the schools. They're coming. I've had to call off of work 3 or 4 times already, just because there's a gun threat or there's a bomb threat.
It's getting to a point where students no longer feel safe at their schools, and we feel that this is a huge problem that administration at every school in Montgomery County should look into.
Coming in here and supporting Seneca Valley and saying, we know what you're going through a little bit, and we know how scary it is, but we're here for you. I feel like it's a good message and something that they can definitely need.
We're asking for more resources, more counselors. We're asking for psychologists at school, for screening for mental health for students and teachers. We're asking for security guards. There's so much that can be done, So we're really just listening for them to listen to us, to listen to our concerns that we have as students, because we're the ones who come here every day.
Next, we'd like you to meet Mrs. Dana Noga. Ms. Noga is a Magruder parent and has some thoughts to share from the incident back in January at Magruder High School.
Hi, my name is Dana Noga. I'm a Montgomery County resident of almost 40 years, an MCPS graduate, and a Magruder High School parent. As a parent, even though I knew the school resource officers had been removed from the schools, like many other parents, I assumed that MCPS knew what they were doing and that our children were safe at school coming back from almost 18 months of virtual learning. January 21st, 2022 will forever change my perception of Montgomery County and MCPS. On that day, Magruder High School was making the news across the nation because the first school shooting in MCPS history, and my youngest child was in that school. At 1:22, I received a text message from my son that the school was in lockdown. At first, my reaction was, okay, something must be going on in the area, and this is out of an abundance of caution, like you read so many times before in other schools. However, things changed very quickly with the school's emails concerning the incident. The emails were cryptic and made no sense, which led me to turn to social media for answers. The social media platforms had numerous posts of what was going on, but nothing was confirmed. A student had been stabbed, there was a fight, and a student was knocked unconscious, hit his head, and was bleeding out in the bathroom. Someone was shot in the foot. Someone had been shot, and the shooter was on foot somewhere in and around the school. Panic was setting in, not knowing if he was safe where he was. Then followed the many phone calls from family, friends, neighbors, and coworkers to find out if my son was okay and if we were okay. The only thing I could assure them was that he was in a locked classroom. My husband and I watched multiple news channels that were live over Magruder, watching what had to be over 100 police vehicles surrounding the schools. We watched as police officers closed off Montcastor Mill Road, watched as officers put on SWAT gear and then entered the school, and watched as the canine units arrived. We watched all the officers not only around the school but in the surrounding neighborhoods. Over the next few hours, I had multiple texts with my son. He was anxious and tired and very unsure of what to make of the whole situation, not knowing when he would be allowed to leave and come home. I tried to offer words of encouragement to ease his anxiety and let him know that we loved him and assured him he would be home soon. Hours passed. We watched the press conference at 5:40, still not knowing when he would be released, and now I had no way of contacting him because his phone died. As the press conference continued, we watched as students started to leave the building. I drove to the top of the street and waited, wondering if he had gotten on the bus or even out of the classroom yet. 7:02, he stepped off the bus and the panic stopped, but all the other emotions took over. I remember my heart sinking to my stomach and I started crying. Over the years, I've watched the news coverage of Columbine High School shooting, where 13 were murdered, coverage of Sandy Hook Elementary massacre, where 26 were murdered, the Parkland shooting, where there were 17 murdered, and most recently, Uvalde shooting, where 21 people were gunned down. I have watched the parents' agony in interviews and heard the unimaginable pain in their voice, the whole time wondering how you go on and recover from such a tragedy. But in the back of my head, being very glad that I have not had to figure out how to pick up those pieces. But after January 21st, I now can better relate to those parents, though not to the same degree, but I understand what they must have been going through, wondering, hoping, praying, through the anxiety, the fear, the sheer terror of the situation. I cannot even find the words how thankful I am that January 21st wasn't worse than it was. No one will ever be able to say an SRO would have changed the situation. We can't turn back the hands of time to find out. However, this last school year, we saw an increase in violent incidents in the school. There had been an increase in fights, a number of stabbings, and multiple guns recovered within the schools, and the first MCPS shooting in history. Here we are a full school year later and now dealing with a teacher shortage, meaning less adults in the school building. I wonder if the people who are put in positions to ensure my children's safety, all students, think that they are doing everything in their power to make sure that the students are safe. No parent should send their child to school and worry about them coming home from school that afternoon. The current CEO 2.0 program is not best practice in school policing and is very reactive program more than a proactive program compared to the SRO program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. We have a panel of individuals that you'll be meeting shortly, including a high school principal, a former school resource officer, a Montgomery County parent, and a recent graduate. But first, we have a video from Gaithersburg High School we'd like you to see.
I feel like that would be a great idea to have police officers back on high school properties because one, they help protect us and they add a little bit more stability than just regular security guards.
What do you think about the possibility of having police officers here back on campus?
I feel like the environment of the school would be like much more safer for everybody, and especially for people who get into fights a lot, so it'd be safer.
I feel that's good for safety for students. Lately, a lot of crimes been happening in school, like shootings and also overall a lot of fights. So I say it's safe for police officers to be in school.
I think it'd be a good idea because it could stop school shootings in the future and stuff like that. So I think it's a good idea.
I think it's a good safety precaution for students. I don't think it's a bad thing. It's really good to have that extra protection for us students, especially with the crimes and the school shootings and stuff like that.
Here at Gaithersburg High School, have you seen an uptick in violence in the past few months that police haven't been around?
Not in Gaithersburg High School, but I've seen the riot in the county, and I've seen what's been going on in the county. I feel like it's a need for them to be in there.
Have you felt unsafe at any time during these past few months here at Gaithersburg High School?
I have felt like there's been times where it's you feel kind of angsty, especially with like the prior or recent school shootings, but I believe it's kind of better to have the extra protection.
See, what changes would you want to see having police back here?
I would say more like inviting, more of them like getting to know the students and stuff like that, making sure that they're safe, that they put the students first for their safety, not like they're a threat in the school.
Okay, sorry for that last little bit of a glitch, but you get the idea from the two videos that we've seen from Seneca Valley High School and Gaithersburg High School that the students are well aware of what is going on in their communities and their concern about safety in the schools. We are pleased this evening to have a recent graduate of Quince Orchard High School. She will share some of her thoughts, and I'd like you to take a moment now to meet Afsara Narin.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Afsara Narin, and I am a graduate of the class of 2022 from Quince Orchard High School in Rica, Rockville. I moved to the United States in 2015. I am a female that was born and raised in a very conservative Muslim family that came from a third world country that faced violence and saw violence on an everyday basis, no matter the color of your skin, your race, or your religion. Growing up in that third world country, I was always taught that police officers were people that you need to be afraid of. But my perspective had completely changed when I met Officer Lowery in 9th grade. In my first 2 years at Quince Orchard High School, he was an accessible resource at all times. He helped me maintain my attendance and constantly reminding me of my goals and motivating me to do better. He created such an impact in my life that 2 years after my change of schools and no communication with him, I still looked for him through teachers and counselors and even Google searches because I could not imagine walking the graduation stage without him. Nor would I be walking that stage without the support he provided for me, the year I was struggling the most with my mental health. The following story I'm going to share with you is a very personal one to me. I debated long and hard with myself about this one. But then I remembered that an MCPS teacher once said to me that the untold stories are the ones that set people free. As I mentioned earlier, I struggled a lot with mental health, and with that came many regretful events. One of them being, one morning of my freshman year in high school, I felt very upset because I couldn't express how much emotions I had bottled up, and I had become a danger to myself. The police were called and 5 police officers showed up to my house, and none of them were able to get me to get the detrimental item out of my possession, solely because I felt like they were doing their job and none of them truly cared for my well-being. In the midst of all that chaos, one of the officers asked me what school I went to, as I replied, Quince Orchard High School. And they had asked if I knew Officer Lowery, and I said, yes, I know Officer Lowery. Shortly after, Officer Lowery showed up, followed by my counselor, Ms. Gaston. They, that day, as a team, were able to ensure my safety. And so when I heard that SROs were being removed from our schools, I thought it would be irresponsible of me as a student to not speak up on this issue, critical to our school's safety. And I'm sure that there are many valid concerns that our student activists brought up, but there are also many positive experiences regarding SROs that are not being heard. And my story is just one of them, and I urge everyone to see both sides of the story.
Thank you, Afsara. I want to take a moment now to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we have some questions for them. If we could start with Dr. Evans.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts regarding a very critical issue in our community, not just our school community, but I'm Lee Evans, proud principal of Colonel Zadok Magruder High School.
Mr. Lowery?
I'm Joseph Lowery. I was the former SRO at Quince Orchard High School for the past 8 years. I retired this past October after serving the county for 33 years as a police officer.
Mr. Dickerson.
I'm Marvin Dickerson. I'm a 25-year resident of Montgomery County. I'm a parent of 2 Montgomery County public school students. And professionally, I'm a security expert. So I've spent probably the last 3.5 years discussing solutions for school safety and security with local officials and elected officials about how they could protect our students and the types of technology and services they should be deploying to help protect our students.
We have some questions that will kind of direct this discussion, but I want the panelists to feel free to jump in. It doesn't necessarily have to be one question per panelist. Start with you, Dr. Evans. Do you find a connection between incidents that happen in the community and the spillover to the school, and what role, if any, does the SRO or CEO have in that phenomenon?
Well, certainly I think that there's a direct connection, and I think that there's a tremendous role that the SRO has played and the CEOs can play in making the connections and communicating between home and school. And what we need to realize, especially now, is that a lot of the challenges we face don't start in our schools. It starts in our communities, in our homes, and we need to have a really good understanding as well as a good knowledge base of what takes place. And we can't do that from the vantage point of being solely in a school. So we need people that are in the communities and people who have contact with the kinds of things that occur that for whatever reasons can be dangerous, can cause harm. So I think that there's a significant role to play in this partnership, and that's what it is. It's a partnership between the law enforcement community, the mental health communities, and the school communities. We try to make a difference in the lives of the children we serve.
Thank you. One of the criticisms that we've heard of with police involvement, and it has come from some of our elected officials also, is the role of SROs in dealing with school discipline. Officer Lowery, share with us any knowledge or experience you have where SROs were dealing in school discipline matters.
Yeah, Mr. Durso, I've also heard this is even recently the county executive mentions that we were involved in discipline. I'm not sure where he's getting that information from. Not just this current MOU involving the new CEO program or the CEO 2.0 program, but if you look back the last 2 or 3 what they call memorandum of understandings, probably over the last 10, 12 years, it specifically talks about that the police officers are not to be involved in discipline. So I'm not sure what context what he means when he says that. Certainly there are lots of things that are things that sort of cross over. If you have an incident at a school where we would do a huddle where oftentimes the principal would get information or one of the assistant principals and bring it to everyone's attention, and myself and maybe the head of security and maybe a counselor would huddle and discuss the situation, but at no time would officers be involved in anything that had to do with school discipline, only things that were safety related.
Thank you. In her opening comments, Ms. Birkinshaw made reference to the school-to-prison pipeline. We hear much about that issue, Mr. Dickerson. How does that relate to police and MCPS, and how should it be addressed?
Well, I think you have to hit it head on. I mean, quite frankly, I think in the context of Montgomery County, it's a red herring. When you really look at the volume, I mean, we have 161,000+ kids in Montgomery County Public Schools. The last data that I saw from 2019 said that there were 159 cases or arrests, right? But when you break down those arrests, 122 of them were citations for marijuana or drug possession. And so then you're now down to about 37 other cases that when you start to break those down, I think out of that 159 or so quote arrests, only 11 of them were real arrests. And out of those 11, I think 4 of them were kids of color. And so if you look at 11 out of 161,000 plus students, you really got to pay attention to the numbers and the data and peel back the onion and really look at each and every situation. What I think is happening, and from, what I didn't tell you, Mike, and in my opening, is I have over 20 years of experience of doing youth development and mentoring youth and working with young people. And I would be one of the last people that would sign on to support any effort to disenfranchise or line up students for a school to prison pipeline. But I could tell you, when I look at the data that I've had access to, and from what I've seen in Montgomery County Public Schools and in Montgomery County, there's not enough evidence to support this around the SRO program. There's not enough evidence to say that we're supporting a school to prison pipeline. I think it's a red herring and not supported.
Sure. Mr. Evans.
One of the things I think when we look at the school to prison pipeline is that there's a lot of misunderstandings and misperceptions about what takes place with that. And that does a disservice because you never really get down to the foundations of why kids turn and do certain things. And then fundamentally, it starts in terms of the kind of foundation that a child has that will put them in a better position, not just to win at school, but to win at life. And the school to prison pipeline starts long before that. It starts, and there is some disproportionality in this whole thing, but it starts not just with how a student is disciplined, and certainly not with the SROs. This has been going on for decades. That has very little to do with the SRO or CEO programs. It has a lot to do with whether or not we have the ability to make hope happen in the lives of children at the very earliest level in school, so that they're willing to take the time to invest in themselves in school, so that they will have options and opportunities that are far away from the evils of society. So I think for those politicians or otherwise that think that they have an answer to that, and they're responding to social injustice, and I fully understand the perils of social injustice, and there's a lot left to do with that. But we do ourselves a disservice when we politicize things. We don't get to the root causes of things because we don't dig down deep enough and make the kinds of changes in the lives of children that's going to make a difference. So we need to take a strong look at that and not put ourselves in a position to go astray and be off track with this. And that's a problem.
Thank you. Afsara, in your comments earlier, you shared some very personal issues centered around mental health. There's been a lot of discussion about mental health professionals in schools. I'm curious, as a recent graduate, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, just having social workers or, mental health professionals in school is never going to be enough because, in our opening remarks, a Magruder parent talked about her feelings regarding, how it felt when her child was in distress and in lockdown and she had no idea how to help her kid. And I don't think any mental health professional or any counselor were trained to step in to that moment, and it's only our law enforcement officers that can do that. So I think it's important to have a balance of both officers and mental health professionals in order to make sure that our students are 100% safe in our school system at all times.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point to that, and that is, and I think it was Susan when she made the reference to response time. In certain situations, time is of the essence and is critical, and especially in an active shooter situation. In an active shooter situation, every 15 seconds somebody gets shot. Okay, that's just based off the data, right? And so every 15 seconds that you can save, you can potentially save a life. And so it is important that, yes, mental health counselors are valuable and they have a role to play. but we have certain situations in our schools, when you look at school safety and security, that you need a well-trained officer in the school. And now, active shooter is one extreme, but what we don't talk about in Montgomery County, when you talk about mental health and other things, is the role that SROs have played in terms of intelligence, getting information to diffuse situations. None of that is captured. When you remove them from those schools, you're losing that. And I haven't seen a solution that's come to the table to counter that resource leaving the equation.
Thank you. Quick anecdote. I kept in touch with the young man. He's since out of high school now, working, actually coaches in the school system. And in his first year of college, he made a couple bad decisions that caused him to come into contact with the discipline at the local level of where he was in school, as well as the school itself. He received the stereotypical one phone call that he could make. Didn't make it to his parent, didn't make it to any relatives, didn't make it to any friends. He called his former SRO, who immediately jumped in, and they were able to resolve it. That would not happen if they had not built up a relationship over the years. And there are just so many of those cases. Dr. Evans, let me come back to you on the mental health issue. As a principal of a large, complex, diverse high school, and having gone through the issue that Ms. Noga talked about from back in January, what are your thoughts on the mental health supports, maybe that you have or maybe that you need?
I can tell you the mental health supports that I'll get, are significant. And I applaud the county and Department of Health and Human Services and other outside agencies for responding not just to my tragedy at Magruder High School, but to the growing concerns that they see throughout all of our school communities and clusters, not just in high school, but elementary school as well. So I think that there's still a lot left to do. I think that there's a very sincere, genuine effort on the part of the school system, on the part of Health and Human Services, on the part of other concerned community organizations, including the police department, the sheriff's department, that people want to just simply not only make a difference in the lives of children, but to save lives. So they have an opportunity to grow and develop in a very peaceful and a caring community.
Mr. Lowery, you served and when you were on active duty with the police department at several different high schools. Any thoughts you have on the mental health piece?
I mean, I think that my success and all the SROs, and even to the CEOs, I mean, I still am very much in contact, is that we all partner with our counselors. Afsara mentioned earlier, before I even knew Afsara, years before she even came into 9th grade, Ms. Gaston and I had worked on a number of different students. Sometimes kids don't come to school. Sometimes it's hard to get a hold of parents to find out where kids are. So it was nice having the resource, the schools like that I could go out and with the PPW and we could find out if the kids were still in the area or not. I think people forget that schools are part of the community. They're not on an island, and everything. We mentioned this earlier that the school is a big, huge, integral part of the community. And oftentimes, as I mentioned before, sometimes things will start in the community and come into the school, or start in the school and come into the community. But things don't always happen during school hours. I can't tell you how many calls I got from patrol officers who, especially after my first year at Quince Orchard, because Quince Orchard's kind of a geographically challenging school because it sits in Gaithersburg, but it's actually in the Rockville district. But when those Gaithersburg officers would have incidents happen on the weekend or after hours, and they knew that there was a chance that would fall into the school's lap the next morning, and they knew they could call me any time, morning, noon, or night. And I had that intimate knowledge. I could call the principal, I could call the counselors, or whoever was affected, and we could have a game plan before school even started that Monday morning. And with this new CEO program, it really doesn't put the officers in the best position to make relationships, because they're masters to all schools and not just one high school and maybe some responsibilities. So to come back around, I think that we really need to talk about that you have to have relationships, and that's what the key, this metric that's missing in this scenario with the CEOs. I mean, I think that you're getting service, but it's not the relationships that really makes the program from the SRO days so effective.
For our viewers who may not be up to speed on duties and assignments, etc., take a minute, Mr. Lowery, to share with us what does a SRO actually do? What if there's such a thing as a typical day, what would it be?
So, I mean, as you mentioned before, I had the pleasure to serve many schools. I started out, actually my first school, I was at Rockville High School, where I did a semester on a temporary assignment. And then I went over to Wooten High School on a temporary assignment when the officer there was having a child. And then I went to Mark Twain. I worked at the old, which is now Blair Ewing Center, and I worked there for a semester. And then finally at Blake High School, I did 3 years there and had the pleasure of working with Ms. Carol Goodman. And then ultimately, I went to Magruder High School, where I was there for a semester, so I met Dr. Evans. And then eventually I ended up over at Quince Orchard. And so I mentioned this legacy of numbers of schools I worked at, because this doesn't even include my time in some of the summer school assignments, is that what I learned is every school is different. Every school has different needs. Magruder, for instance, there are no sidewalks. The kids don't walk to school. There's pretty much every kid either catches the bus, is driven to school, or drives to school. Quince Orchard, on the other hand, it's a completely different dynamic. So at Magruder High School, I didn't have a lot of traffic duties, for instance, in the morning. Quince Orchard, another story. We had crazy traffic because we had people arriving at the school by bicycle, on foot, in cars. We had metro buses, which also Magruder didn't have. So typically that's what you would start your day out at, helping with traffic control. In general, if you had especially once the school had been underway for a couple weeks to a month, that's when you would start getting requests from community folks, parents, staff members, to start having preemptive meetings with the SRO, in my case me, because they had some concerns that were identified early on before they became issues. And so we would sit down and we would make the time for the parent or make the time for the community. QO was kind of an interesting school because it was probably a paradise for students, because it was literally across the street from 3 shopping centers and, I don't know, maybe 30 restaurants. So oftentimes kids would go during lunch hour and go across, and maybe they weren't on their best behavior, but those businesses knew my phone number. They knew who I was, and if we had an issue with a kid doing something, whether it be skipping class or causing another issue, they knew to call me first and not 911, unless it was an emergency, because they knew I knew the kid who it was. And under this SRO, the CEO model, you don't have that time to do that because you're answering to all the schools. So anyway, so you get through the day, and maybe oftentimes a lot of us teach. I taught blocks on drug and alcohol awareness. I taught Fourth Amendment search and seizure in our law classes. I oftentimes taught with the folks who were working in our child development, before they got the kids, about child neglect awareness. So it was 95% of my day was really pleasant, because it was encounters with public members from the community, from staff, from kids, from parents, where everyone had an issue that they felt if we could get in front of the issue, we could probably take care of the issue. And so I found that to be very rewarding, to the point where instead of staying the 4 years at QO, I wanted to follow a 9th grade class until they graduated. I actually was able to stay for 2 4-year cycles and actually see students like Afsara, for instance. That was my second set of 9th graders I had follow through. So we also you think about some of the extracurricular events that we do. Quince Orchard has a huge football following and huge basketball games. We have prom. We have things like homecoming. There are other dances. And so SROs were part of the planning committees, part of the day-to-day activities at the school, whether it be weather events. I remember one time we had a tornado warning at QO, and I knew at first thing in the morning, when this alert went off, the school actually went into a weather lockdown. And I knew historically that during first period, a lot of kids don't come straight to school, they go to McDonald's. So I went to McDonald's, I called the manager of McDonald's, and I knew he knew me. He answered the phone right away because he had my number, and I told him, I said, all the kids there, make sure they stay in the building, in your restaurant. And so I went over there, and as more kids got off the bus who were coming late, I ushered them into the school. And so, as it turns out, the tornado didn't hit our area, But it was a wonderful feeling knowing that if I looked at a kid getting off the bus, that kid already knew who I was. They already knew I was a trusted adult, and so they knew without hesitancy, if I asked them to do something in a quick manner, they did it because they knew that it must be something serious. And so I know that's kind of a shotgun approach to everything, all our duties, but there's so many things we do. I've written letters of recommendation. I've done help kids get jobs. I've mediated more than my share of domestic issues, both between students and maybe their boyfriend or girlfriends, including some of the things that happen at domestic-related things that happen in people's homes between their students and the parents. There's so many different things that officers do who work in the schools, but you cannot be effective if you do not have the relationship. You have to have the exposure to the kids, and the kids have to have the exposure to you. My experience with Afsara was because she was interested in 9th grade with being in JROTC. And being in uniform myself, I saw this young lady in her sharp, I'm not sure if they were dressed beiges or greens, and that's how we first started talking about that. And before long, we were talking about other things that were bothering her in the community, et cetera, along with other kids. So I think that it's really frustrating to me because when I look at the loudest voices in the community and in our county government, and I even wonder to this day, I've asked this question at the end of the school year this year, how many times has the county executive or any of the council members actually spent a day in a high school? Now, the last time I know Mr. Rice came was 4 years ago at 2018 when there was a kind of a viral video that he did that I happened to participate in where he came to Quince Orchard and we talked about it. And with all the violence we've had in the school and all the gun violence we've had, I scratch my head and I wonder, especially after what happened at Dr. Evans' school, where are our politicians? Why have they not gone to the school and actually spent a day there and actually talked to the kids instead of trying to get sound bites for the media? And so it's very frustrating, even though I don't have, my children are all grown, they're not in the schools, I'm no longer employed as a police officer in Montgomery County. It still frustrates me because I know what can happen if we aren't using the village that we've been truly blessed with. We have some wonderful people in our community, to include our teachers, our counselors, our administrators, but we have wonderful police officers who not only who work in the schools, but also who work in the adjoining communities. And I feel like it's just like some of the things I read and hear, it's almost like they're saying officers are deviants. And if you know anything about the SRO program, you know that the majority of the SROs, I'm not taking this away from the folks who are not of color, but the majority of the SRO program is 80% minorities. Most of us are African American. And a lot of people are surprised to hear that. The majority of us are in our 40s, 50s. There's even a few people a little older than that. And the bottom line is that we really need a village to help all the kids and not just one group of people.
Thank you. Mr. Dickerson, let's follow up on that a little bit because we've heard from our politicians who have said that schools actually are safer without SROs. I know you've been involved within your community and also speaking with elected officials about safety concerns. Your general thoughts on that topic?
Well, I kind of laughed the first time that an elected official said to me that schools are safer without SROs, and I challenged him. And I have been having this conversation for now about 24 to 26 months with elected officials, and most recently with our county executive, in which I had successfully secured a commitment from our new superintendent, our chief of police, and even the county exec to sit down in a room with parents, myself, and representatives from community partners to really talk through the SRO program, their CEO program, and how we could work together to make it better for our community and for the students that we're trying to serve. And those commitments were made in April, early May, and to this date, that meeting has not happened. I recognize that, the end of school year had to happen, but, I even took the step to agreed to host the meeting myself. And in fact, I suggested that I host the meeting. And then I got a call back from the county executive's staff person saying that the meeting, he would agree to meet, but not with the superintendent and the chief there. So that to me said that that was not a sincere commitment to resolve the issue or move forward. And so as a parent, as a taxpayer, I'm not going to play those games. I'm just going to call them as I see it, because I have 2 kids that are in those schools every day when school is in session. And I'm going to do everything that I can to protect them and other students like them that are in those schools. And I just don't think our elected officials, as I think Mr. Lowery alluded to, are committed to doing any more than just doing a lot of lip service to this issue. But I will tell you, none of these communities that we talked about early thought that their community would be in the news. You know, they were in the crowd of if this will happen. I think we all need to be in the crowd of when this happen, what we're going to do. Because we don't know when a situation will come to our community. And we need to be prepared for it.
Dr. Evans, the officer assigned to Magruder has other duties beyond Magruder, if I'm not mistaken. Would you share that with our viewers?
Well, he's with the Sheriff's Department, and I'm not sure what his duties are, but I know that Sheriff Popkin has made a strong commitment, as he has for the last 12 years. So I think some of that may have been compromised in terms of Sheriff Popkin's commitment to Magruder High School. So I know he has other duties, but his availability not only to Magruder High School, but all of the schools in our cluster, pre-K through 12, is what it's about in the Magruder cluster. So Sergeant Capetta certainly has made himself available, not just during the school day, but throughout the day and the evening to ensure the safety of students and staff in our school. So I think that that's a good model. And I don't know that, those kind of resources are available to everyone, but I know we've been able to benefit from that in the best kind of way imaginable. So it's certainly a gift that Sheriff Popkin has given to the Magruder cluster, and we certainly do appreciate it.
Mr. Lowery, can you share with us, because we were expecting a representative from the police department, but that scheduling became a bit of a challenge. Do you know the current strength of the CEO program, just in terms of how many schools are covered?
Well, I know that, under the current CEO 2.0, or even the original one, is that the coverage was going to be more primary in nature. So historically, SROs were assigned to a high school. That's where they were. That's their bread and butter. That's where they were expected to be. And if you had an issue at a middle school or an elementary school, depending on the situation, you would oftentimes just be a liaison for those situations. So a patrol officer would get dispatched to those schools, and then we would be available for telephone calls. And if it was something that was serious or complex enough, we might actually go visit the middle school. Under the current CEO model, if a call happens at a cluster middle school, and keep in mind that some of these we don't have enough CEOs to cover every cluster. So before we had 26 SROs, one per high school and one at the Blair Ewing. Now it's somewhere in that 17 to 20 range, and instead of them being primary at one high school or Blair Ewing, the alternative school, they have to serve all 200 plus schools. So although Sergeant Capetta is a good fit, he was an SRO before at Magruder, so he does have relationships that maybe some of the other CEOs wouldn't have. Oftentimes, if he gets a call at a middle school and elementary school, he is the primary person who has to handle that call, not patrol anymore. So if you just do the math, you just can't clone him or clone other officers. If you look at our number of officers based on our school size, we have 160,000 officers. 160,000 children in our school system, and we have, I think, if everyone's healthy and at work, we have, let's say, between 17 and 23 CEOs. Look at somebody like Baltimore County, which has less students than we have. They have literally 4 times as many SROs. They have, and they call them SROs there. They actually have, I think, between 78 and 82 is what the number I received. And even Anne Arundel County, which has half the size of the number of students that we have, around 80,000 students, they have 40, almost 50 SROs. So they're able to, and of course, this is complicated because we're having trouble with recruiting it's a national and a state issue, but we have to look at what are our priorities, what going forward, what are our priorities?
Afsara, you might not be prepared for this one, but I'm curious as to your thoughts. We've heard that uniforms are traumatic for students from personal experience, if not from SROs in schools. How do you strike the balance for students that are terrified of uniformed officers, as well as kids who are terrified to come to school without SROs? And I'm just curious, from your experiences as a recent graduate and as a recent high school student, have you run into that with either yourself or any of your friends, or knowledge of this concern about students being intimidated by someone in uniform?
Right. So, again, personally speaking, I myself regretfully have had quite a couple of interactions with police officers, and honestly, having that one-on-one interaction and bond with an SRO in the school community took that fear out of uniform for me when those police officers were trying to help me outside the school building. And it led me to actually cooperate with those police officers to, ensure my safety or other safety and all that. As well as, I think, it's really I don't think that SROs wake up one morning and they're like, okay, my goal is to arrest a student today. I think most SROs choose to be there because they genuinely have that relationship and that bond. And having these SROs in uniforms within the school system is going to get these kids to grow up to be adults that trust their law enforcement. So I think it's important and not quite traumatic per se, because if these students really take the time to get to know their SROs one-on-one, they'll know that these are, at the end of the day, ultimately, these are just adults they can fall back on.
So I'm curious, if someone asked you, what advice would you give to an incoming high school student in terms of safety and security and being able to figure out things? What are some things you might suggest?
To an incoming freshman, I would probably say, don't be intimidated by the adults around you. Get to know them. It can, coming from middle school into high school, it can be nerve-wracking. Yes, but once you build that rapport with your security officers, with your SROs, with your counselors, administrators, main office, school it's not going to seem like such a task anymore. It's going to seem like more something I guess you enjoy going to every day, which basically happened in my case. Once I built that rapport with people, it became something I enjoyed doing rather than a chore I have to do every morning.
Thank you. Mr. Dickerson, in addition to, we talked a bit about the school-to-prison pipeline, there's also concerns about disproportional arrest rates. Your thoughts on that? I don't know if we have any statistics, or if Mr. Lowery has any statistics on that, but just curious where you were on that one.
Well, I mean, I think I covered that a little bit when I broke down the 2019 data. But I think there are a lot of, I think you really have to look at the details of those specific arrests. And you have to look at, you have to look at the data. and how the data is cut, how it is analyzed, and the analytics around those data. I think when you have a very small number, let's say, for example, I used the situation of 11 arrests, right? And then you have 4 of them of color, right? You're going to end up with a 40% rate or higher for people of color in that situation. But what we're really talking about is 4 arrests out of a population of 161,000 folks. So you really have to get off the top line and drill down into the data. And I think a lot of times what's happening, and I think it was really amplified during the George Floyd situation. Folks, rightfully so, folks were angry and upset, and they reacted. And I think there were a lot of national narratives, but they don't all apply to Montgomery County Public Schools or the SRO program. And so I think you really have to peel back the onion a little bit and look at the data and look at the specific scenarios.
Mr. Lowery, do we have any current statistics that you're aware of that address the arrest rate
there was some data
since the removal of SROs?
There was the data I gave you guys before, but there was some data before. I'm not sure if it's made it onto this program today, but
okay.
I know that the way we get data now is different because there was a lot of data that the council was concerned wasn't collected because we couldn't say how many interactions the officers had with students, how many times were other things happening. Here's what I can tell you when it comes to data. Data is it's a great metric to measure things by, but it doesn't tell the story, as Marvin mentioned. One of the things that from talking to folks at Quince Orchard and the other schools I still have connections with, and I don't know if Afsara would even be able to speak to this, I don't know, because I haven't talked to her in a couple years really, is that what I'm finding is that there's this trend where kids, particularly kids of color, are not reporting being victimized, not just at school but in the community. And so that is a very troubling thing to me, because I saw that at almost every school I started at, where if I started at a school, especially if there wasn't an officer there for maybe the previous year, or maybe they'd had a series of officers come through, that once you are connected with the kids will come and tell you things before they happen. And that's the other thing. How do you articulate data when people come to you and say there's going to be a big fight after school, or there's going to be a fight at McDonald's across the street, and you put things in place where those incidents do not happen? And so now we're not having that ability to do that prevention that we could do before, or even if you have the event happen, that you were able to make a couple phone calls, call a couple parents, and because you have that trust and that relationship, you're able to quickly get what the real incident was, not what someone said, and you'll be able to put things into place where you could have solutions. We do under the old SRO program. I can't speak to the CEO program because I wasn't a CEO. But I wonder, how many mediations are officers able to do? If you just do the number of the fact that they have all these schools they have to cover and everything else. And I know the school system has done a really wonderful job to address some of those shortcomings. But I think that the main thing is prevention is something that we just don't talk enough about. And so I really worry, especially if you look at a lot of our kids who are at-risk kids to begin with, a lot of our kids who've come here from other countries, a lot of them are unaccompanied minors, and so a lot of those kids, QO had a fairly large ESOL population, and so I worry that we're not giving everyone that village approach that they deserve.
Another of my favorite SRO stories, and people maybe have heard this before, but I think it's worth repeating. I had the good fortune in my last several years at Springbrook High School to work with an SRO named Rodney Barnes, who has since retired. Rodney was so good that we actually had on occasion gang members who would tip him off if something was going to happen. They'd be very discreet about it. Obviously, he can't be seen cozying up to the officer on a regular basis. but I can't tell you just how many incidents never materialized because we were able to get out ahead of it. That would not have happened if they didn't know and trust him. Springbrook had the tradition of inviting a staff member to be the speaker at graduation, and in 2010, that same SRO was invited to speak at graduation. That just doesn't happen by accident. So, I think people should be aware of that. I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to maybe capsulize what we've discussed this evening, and any closing thoughts as we wrap up this forum. Mr. Evans, why don't we start with you?
Well, first and foremost, I think having forums like this, communicating, discussing, is really crucial to meeting of the minds and having all those individuals that are concerned with the safety of our students and those that work with our students in our schools. I think one of the mistakes that we make is that complacency sets in and think that we have the luxury of debate when it comes to doing the things that are needed, and we don't. When you look at what's happened in Montgomery County, it goes far beyond schools. It's in our communities, and the urbanization of Montgomery County is something that we need to focus on, because at the root of our problems are things that have overwhelmed our communities, and that I'm not just talking about the tough things that children have to go to, but the things that our families have to go through. And we need to meet the needs of our families. We need to establish the kinds of partnerships that are going to make a difference. And the law enforcement, through SROs and CEOs, are an integral and now critical part of the work that we need to do to educate our children. That doesn't happen unless we have safe schools. And if we continue to play this political game based upon certain concepts of what's out of control, social injustice and racism has been a part of this country for a long time, and it's going to continue to be. So what we have to do is to realize that and understand fully that we can deal with those issues in a very serious way, parallel with the work that we have to do in keeping schools safe. And we don't have to limit ourselves. We can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Thank you. Mr. Lowery.
It's hard for me to keep things brief, but I'll try. So, I think it really does come down to relationships and partnerships. We have to, there's some unprecedented things that are happening in our community, in our country. Just recently, we have the Supreme Court who changed, just like overnight, how easy it's going to be for people to get not just a firearm, but also how to have it concealed on their person. That's a huge difficulty that police departments and school systems and everyone's going to have to deal with. The proliferation of ghost guns that we've had in our community. I think the last time I checked, the statistics were we had about 600 or 700 guns just here in Montgomery County that were taken off the streets. And a significant portion of those was ghost guns. The scarier thing is that the gun I think that was used in the Magruder situation, that was a ghost gun. That was something that a kid was able to order who wasn't even 18 years of age. And even though we did pass legislation that basically essentially makes a ghost gun more or less illegal, that's fentanyl is illegal. But we managed to have metric tons of that come into our country. On top of that, we've had unprecedented legal gun sales. Even before this year, if you were to drive past any gun store, you could see people were lined up around the block because they felt like this whole defunded police movement meant that they needed to arm themselves. So we have access to guns that we've never, ever had. I cannot even imagine if I was a chief or a superintendent or a parent, where would I begin? And what I would say is that I'm going to change the focus a little bit of my conversation a little bit and just say we need to partner with each other. So Will Jawando or Craig Rice or Hans Reamer, David Blair, whoever, we need to partner with people because we need a true village. I'm tired of hearing politicians say, well, these are national trends. Montgomery County has never, I served here since 1988. We've never been about following trends. We've always been trailblazers in this county. And so we need to get back together like we used to do, put our differences aside, and come together and figure this thing out and make sure we're available for our children, because at the end of the day, it's a community. It has to be a partnership and relationship.
Thank you. Mr. Dickerson.
Well, once again, following Joe took my thunder. Joe, I agree, and ditto on your comments. I think it's about providing a platform and opportunity for parents, members of the community, law enforcement, school officials, and elected officials to sit down and come up with a solution that works. In all of this discussion, parents were not asked or brought to the table and provided an opportunity to weigh in on the impact of removing the SROs out of the schools. I think that needs to happen, and I think that needs to happen in a big way. And I think, once we get through this election cycle, I think it is very important, whoever is the county exec, whoever is elected to the council, needs to sit down and not have press releases or Zoom meetings where they are pointing fingers at the police or the school board or the superintendent. They all need to be in the same room, and they need to come out with something that works, because what they have right now is going to fall short. And I have the advantage of having had work with multiple school districts around the country around school safety and school security, and I can tell you we have a lot of things going good for us here, but we also got a lot of work to do, and it's going to take partnership and relationship and trust. And right now, the parents, by and large, do not have any faith in this program that is as is currently suited. So,
thank you. Afsara, this is the third forum of this type that we've had, and we've talked about having student panelists, but for whatever reason, that didn't happen until this evening. The viewers might be surprised or maybe interested to know that this time last night, I'm not sure if we knew what your role was going to be, but you certainly have handled yourself well. I'd like to get your thoughts on what we've discussed this evening as we wrap it up. But make no mistake, you have a bright future ahead of you.
Thank you so much. I think Officer Lowery, Dr. Evans, and Mr. Dickerson basically summed it all up. If I were to sum up the evening, and if I were to say what a safe school would be for me, I would probably say that it needs a lot more parent involvement, and parents should definitely have a say on whether or not these SROs should be present in school and in their students' lives. Because I know my parents were delighted that Officer Lowery was in my life. I think that counselors, teachers, everybody needs to work together to ensure our safety as students in the school community.
Thank you. We want to thank MyMCM for their support and involvement with this evening's program, all of our CPPS colleagues who have worked behind the scenes for this. And in going forward, I hope that people will take time to digest what we've discussed, think about some of the different things that need to be done to keep our young people safe, because if we don't do that, if we cannot make each of our 200, soon to be 210 schools safe and secure, then the education really just does not follow as it should. Thank you for your time, and we appreciate your viewing this evening.